This podcast is brought to you by www.stopspreadinghate.com, a global organization dedicated to ending racism and preventing future generations from experiencing hate.
Hi everyone! Welcome back to the 5th episode of Long Story Shorts. I am your host Sarah.
And I'm your host Katrina.
Today we have a very exciting episode for you guys. We will be reviewing a memoir by an infamous South African comedian and writer, Trevor Noah, who hosted The Daily Show from 2015 to 2022.
His award-winning autobiography titled Born a Crime was published in 2016 by Anchor Canada and highlights his many struggles growing up as a colored child during the apartheid in South Africa. However, despite the heavy subject matter, Trevor effectively communicates how people can rise above their situations through resiliency, hope, and an unwavering sense of humor. Instead of fighting the system head-on, Trevor learned the art of mocking the system, as said on page 252.
Let's get into it! From 1948 to 1944, the apartheid in South Africa was legalized segregation between white and black citizens. Black people were stripped of a proper education, voting rights, self-determination, and opportunities by being forced into small ghettos and rudimentary schools. However, Trevor's story takes place during the tail end of apartheid when Nelson Mandela, a freedom fighter and first black president of South Africa, was released from prison and was able to slowly break down the rules and regulations of apartheid. This allowed Trevor and his family to experience more freedom than once had, although freedom is still a relatively restrictive concept back then.
The fact that Trevor grew up during the apartheid makes his story incredibly unique for most children growing up in the 90s. Not only was he an outsider his entire life, he was also put through hardships some people couldn't even begin to imagine. However, what makes his story unique from other colored and black kids during the apartheid was that he was raised with the possibility of a bright future. Trevor's mother made it a priority to ensure that she gave Trevor many opportunities to become something great. As Trevor says on page 73, "My mom raised me as if there was no limitations on where I could go or what I could do." Whereas, many other children weren't provided with the same educational resources as he was. For example, on page 262, Trevor mentions how his mother bought him the books she never got to read and took him to the schools that she never got to go to, which demonstrates how he broke down the walls of generational poverty. Unfortunately, not all families were that lucky, and Trevor reflects on how he willingly chose to spend time in Alexandra, a shanty town left over from pre-apartheid days, in his teenage years to sell CDs. Even though he came from a better neighborhood, he states on 224 that "I chose to live in that world, and I wasn't from that world. If anything, I was an imposter. Day to day, I was in it as much as everyone else, but the difference was that in the back of my mind, I knew I had other options. I could leave, they couldn't." The theme of generational poverty, communicated by this quote, is a very important aspect of Trevor's memoir, as it serves to demonstrate the long-lasting impact of racism and inequality in South Africa.
Just to add on to what Katrina is saying, what makes Trevor's story all the more unique is his heritage and how colored he is, funnily enough. During the time of the apartheid, the original peoples of South Africa were bred out of existence through interracial relationships. Therefore, the majority of colored people in South Africa had no clearly defined heritage to go back to, as written on page 116. Therefore, most colored children only grew up, or really recognized, their white heritage. Although Trevor was colored, he had a direct connection to his heritage and essentially knew where he came from, as his mother was black and his father was white. Therefore, Trevor believes that colored people had it the worst during the apartheid, as they had no idea where they came from, and which impacted their sense of identity and belonging. Themes of identity, belonging, and community are central to Trevor's story, as he always felt out of place due to his unique mixed background. Growing up, he often spent time alone and could not sustain well-developed relationships. For example, on page 141, he says that, "Although I wasn't popular, I wasn't an outcast. I was everywhere with everybody, and at the same time, I was all by myself," because he didn't exactly fit into the predetermined labels and groupings of the apartheid.
Good points. However, despite the prominent individuality Trevor shows throughout his story, there are also many hints towards society struggles as a whole. Trevor expresses many times throughout the novel how his history, along with those of many others, have not only been pushed aside, but also completely diminished in some cases. He spends pages explaining how, in school, they weren't taught their own tragedies because it wasn't important, because it wasn't the history of the Western powers that control the dominant narratives of the world. Trevor's history was brushed over and made less, just like many other countries who aren't seen as important as the ones displayed in the media. Trevor explains how the only reason the Holocaust was seen as the biggest tragedy in the West is because it was documented, unlike many African tragedies, such as the genocide in the Congo, which demonstrates how ethnocentrism is rampant in North America. So it's either society doesn't view other cultures at all, or they only view them with very specific ideas, those of which were given to them at a young age. A good example of this is in the 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She expresses how she grew up with specific perceptions of other cultures based on what she was given as a child, and then later on, when she moved out of Nigeria, she realized that many people have similar ways of identifying her, and most of them were negative. She expresses how, of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, but there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important. It is just as important to talk about them. Again, another example of the importance of knowing about other cultures, the importance of breaking away from ethnocentrism and understanding that knowledge of the world is essential. And this part of the novel really resonates with me because I believe that this part, or like this whole part that he's trying to explain, is really specific to the world today. And I believe that since the world is already so divided right now, I think it's really important that we are able to acknowledge that we're all as important as each other and that we need to break away from ethnocentrism as a whole.
I also really agree with Katrina's point because in a world divided by politics, I think it's so important that as a society, we kind of break away from that and we realize that everyone is as important as yourself. And another example, although not always obvious, about how this book is universal is how it reveals the human condition, a term used to describe the universal resiliency and resolve of a person. Despite all the hardships Trevor endured, he was able to overcome any predicament thrown at him by his ability to laugh. Trevor constantly reflects on how the books he read and the lessons he received from his mother shaped his ability to be witty and question society in a satirical manner. Throughout the novel, he uses satirical comments and examples to demonstrate how illogical the entire apartheid was, as well as personal matters that arose in his life. To provide an example of his satire, when discussing cultural exports in South Africa, one of them being McDonald's, he states on page 189, "McDonald's to me tasted like America. McDonald's is America. You see it advertised and it looks amazing. You crave it, you buy it, you take your first bite and it blows your mind. Then halfway through, you realize it's not all it's cracked up to be. A few bites later, you're like, there's a lot wrong with this." Many people use humor as a coping mechanism for the situations around them, and Trevor is just one example. The ability to live life happily by seeing the positive in any situation is not isolated to Trevor's story. If anything, he is the perfect example of how people can remain hopeful. Humor itself is also universal because everyone loves to laugh and feel good. For example, on page 141, Trevor states how even though he didn't belong to one group, he could be a part of any group that was laughing. The use of his satire throughout the novel really resonated with me as like a literary device because I also use humor in my life to kind of help me deal with the hardships, and that's something that my family also does as well. So it kind of connected to with me on a personal level because it's something that I've been exposed to as a child throughout all my years. And I also think that humor is such a crucial part to connecting humanity, and it's kind of like a universal love language. Like everyone loves to laugh and everyone loves to have fun. And I just think his use of satire kind of connects various audiences and makes it more engaging.
These connections are so important because it's very important to educate yourself by reading novels and memoirs that allow for deeper connections to be built towards the issues they're facing. Many universal experiences like struggling to make friends or having family issues are shared in a novel. It also allows the reader to empathize with their situation because narratives offer a more engaging way to learn about the world around you. It is crucial that we hear the personal account of others because we will risk the danger of a single story, discussed by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. It is one thing to learn about the facts surrounding their situation, but it's another thing to understand their pain.
Exactly. So not only do I, but Katrina also believes that everyone should read this novel. Trevor is able to discuss larger societal issues while demonstrating how humanity can always flourish. In his memoir, Trevor uses many examples of literary devices to enhance his writing and make it more engaging to his audience. One important example of this is satire, as mentioned above, but there are also a whole host of symbols found within the pages. One example of them is language and how it symbolizes a bridge between the race gap and a connection between all people. He drives this point home by saying, when you make the effort to speak someone else's language, even if it's just basic phrases here and there, you are saying to them, I understand that you have a culture and identity that exists beyond me. I see you as a human being, which was written on page 236. I find this idea to be really important to the story because themes of identity and community and belonging resurface throughout the entire novel. And his ability to recognize that everyone is a human being and that we all need to belong, we all need to feel like we belong and connect to one another is really important to society today. And with that, I think it's the perfect time to start wrapping up the episode. And just to kind of recap, we introduced you to South African comedian Trevor Noah and his story.
We gave a brief intro into what it was like for a young colored boy to grow up under apartheid and how that made his story unique. Since not only was he provided education unlike the other kids at that time, but he was also a different type of colored because he could trace back his heritage, making him unique in many ways.
But then, we also found ways in which his story could be universal throughout the lives of many. Through ethnocentrism and cultural exports, his story related to many.
We also evaluated his writing techniques and what makes this autobiography worth reading.
All while connecting it back to why narrative is so important to society.
Alrighty, everybody, this wraps up the 5th episode of Long Story Short.
Today we had a pretty hefty discussion on Trevor Noah's book, but we are finally nearing the end.
We are so glad that you could tune in today, and make sure to follow our Instagram at Long Story Short to keep up to date with future events.
We are always looking for recommendations on books to read and review, so please email your choices to longstoryshort@gmail.com.
And if you wish to help, visit www.stopspreadinghate.com to learn more about its impact, or visit www.learnabouthistory.com to explore new ways to educate the world.
And remember, always look for the bright side of things.